about this issue that people can't, they're not explicitly detecting the function words. But what happens if somebody violates the typical norm using the function word? So if you wrote the email to the dean and didn't include all of the I's, would the dean have a different impression of
Yes,
you?
absolutely. So we do pick up something's weird. What we wouldn't ever say, oh man, that person's using pronouns
Right,
wrong.
right,
You know,
right.
and all of us have had that experience. An undergraduate who we've never met writes and refers to us too familiarly.
Yeah.
You know, it's just kind of a little bit creepy, but yeah.
A point of clarification, when you said somebody who's not telling the truth tends to, your word over include, what did you mean by that?
They use words like and, with, words such as that. So if I ask, what did you do last night? And you're trying to hide what you did, you'll say, well, we went to the store and then we did this and then we did that. It's really interesting. It's almost impossible when you're lying to say what you didn't do because you're already saying what you didn't do, and it just, you know, I get a headache thinking about the complexities of trying to use exclusive words when I'm lying. I never lie, of course.
So how well can you detect lies?
With the computer program, in reasonably controlled context, 67% accuracy where 50% is chance, which, if you don't know anything about the deception literature,
That's really great.
Exactly. But you know, I tell this to a lot of people, and they think, "Well, that's ridiculous." Well, guess what? That's
Better than the lie wizards.
It is. No, it is, and it's better than eyewitness testimony. In terms, you know, and this raises a lot of interesting issues about what we allow in court. I mean, this should be allowed in court the same way that polygraph, eyewitness testimony, all of these, but somehow we need to train juries to know how to think of probabilities.
Well, have you ever been approached as a jury consultant?
Not as a jury consultant. I am.
Or as a testimonial consultant? Where you-
I have, but when I do, I basically say, you know, you're going to be screwed because here are the issues. And any lawyer picks up on that immediately. I am used, though, by lawyers and investigative teams sometimes as to try to, you know, figure out probabilities. Yes?
Is there evidence that people use, perhaps unconsciously, function words to understand the mental states of others?
Give me an example.
Well, there's this literature on theory of mind, where there's a whole variety of tasks, and somebody is asked to say what was on the mind of somebody else, or what they were intending to do.
You know, that's a very interesting question. And you're the first person to ask that, and one of my good friends is a theory of mind person. That would be a natural thing to look at, to see how these words fit into theory of mind, but I don't know of anybody who's looked at it.
I'm really blown away by the data that shows that cross-culturally, that these patterns hold cross-culturally. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about like what kind of blogs. You mentioned they were mostly English blogs. Like what kind of blogs you're looking at?
We look at, you know, we look at all types of blogs. My favorite are kind of just the general ones like livejournal.com or blogs.com or blog.com, I guess it is. We've looked at these with, say, breast cancer blogs in Spanish, focusing primarily on Mexico, Germany, South Korea, two others. And we find fairly similar patterns. So those obviously aren't lie studies, but they tell us a lot about how people are thinking and using words. We have done some with depression versus not depression blogs. So for example, and I should say, once you get into these other languages, and for many of you in this room, you know this, every language that we have gone into, we find some really important and interesting differences in function words. And the way that a culture uses function words, I think, says a lot about the culture itself. So the obvious one would be formal versus informal you, or looking, and some languages will not have these words as separate standalone words, but they're implicit in the verb or some other part of speech. Or in Japanese or Korean, where you have all of these subtle power markers. And it's interesting, we have the power markers too, but we've never thought of I as a power marker, but in a funny kind of way that it is. With the depression blogs, for example, it's interesting with Spanish versus English because, as you know, Spanish as a pronoun drop, you hardly ever say, I'm happy. You rarely say yo estoy feliz. You just say estoy feliz. The only time you would ever use the yo is when you're emphasizing. In depression blogs, yo is used at very high rates for Spanish. So it's almost as though when a person is depressed, they are emphasizing self more than they normally do. So our jumping into these different languages has been interesting and a little bit haphazard. The Luke program is now available in about, I don't know, probably, I'm going to guess, 15 languages. The usual European ones, but we also have Chinese and Russian, and we just got Serbian, and others. But here's the interesting thing. I now realize that spending all this time translating Luke was a remarkably stupid idea, because what we started doing is just using Google Translate, and use Google Translate for this other language, and translate it into English and run our Luke program in English. Now you're saying, well, I've used Google Translate. It's not that good. It makes all these errors. Well, it's making errors on content words. It does a fine job on function words. And that's all we're interested in. And when we've done these comparisons with carefully translated everything, the Google Translate system works just about as well. Mm-hmm.
So the examples you gave of status differences in the use of I were to do with formal status, right? Undergraduates, professors, dean. But is there any data showing how the status differences emerge in, say, spontaneously forming groups or
Yes, a lot of them. So, for example, boy, here's an interesting thing. And once I say this, it won't be surprising at all. You get two people, two random college kids, same sex. You put them in a room and you have them talk for 15 minutes. And then afterwards, you give them a questionnaire asking them, which of the two of you has higher status? The two people agree at reasonably good rates, a correlation between 0.3, 0.5. They never talk about money. They never talk about anything we would deem as status. But I think on a good average is you look at the other person, you do this assessment of age, how big they are, how attractive they are, how they're dressed, and so forth, and you come up with this immediate sense of status, and the two of you agree, it's never spoken about, and we see it in the language. So it's very interesting in terms of how that works. Yeah?
And then within that same scenario, can you then track who is style matching to whom? Like, is there a group of people that come and meet in the middle, or how does that?
We've just started doing that, and so we can do that. The hassle of it, you do it on a turn-by-turn basis. So you can actually look and see who's kind of leading the others. I would say, more than half, there is this jockeying. It goes back and forth. Whereas, and probably 30% of the time, one is the clear leader most of the time. Mm-hmm.
So once this is understood, has it been used strategically by some of your participants to how they interact with other people, or is it the type of thing like you were saying that because we can't really tell that it's not?
I think it's just too hard to do, and if you tried to do it strategically in natural conversation, you would be hopelessly lost listening to these features of language. It's been very interesting for me. I remember when I first started to get into this thinking, okay, I'm going to train myself to hear pronouns. So I was watching a movie, and I started listening, and I realized I had to listen very closely. And when I did that, I lost track of what the movie was about. You kind of have a choice. Do you want to watch the movie or listen to pronouns? Yeah.
Think a bit about the difficulties in deciding how easy it is to detect the lies.
Mm-hmm.
And can you clarify us? I mean, you ask your subjects to tell the truth or to lie. How?
Well, we've done it in a lot of different ways. So one is my favorite is called we use it's a system where it's called a mock crime. So we'll sit down with them initially and we'll say, okay, you're about to participate in a study where what's going to happen is you're going to be asked to go down to a room down the other end of the hall, and you're going to sit in a chair, and on the left side of you will be a big red book, and I want you to go in there and open it to page 160. Now there might be a dollar bill there, and if there is, it's yours. You steal it. But you cannot tell anyone you took it. If anybody asks you, you say you didn't take it, and you convince them that you didn't take it. Now, are you willing to do this? We'll give you, freedom from the university if they press charges and these kind of things. So they go down, open the book, and half the people open it to page 160, and there's nothing there, and the other half there's $1. And they all take the money. And then someone comes in a few minutes later, they go over, pick up the book, and they said, there's no money here, did you take it? Everybody says no. And then we say, then you'll have to come with me to the interrogation room, where we then hook them up to a polygraph and videotape them and ask a number of open-ended questions. We've also had people write essays on their true beliefs of abortion, and then to write an essay on the opposite view and write it as though you really believe it. And so those are the kinds of essay systems we've used. Yes?
So obviously there's a lot of overlap in how people speak and how they write, but have you found any differences where some effects don't replicate when you found it in the writing but not in speaking, or vice versa?
Almost everything we found in writing, we've also found in speaking. But you're right, there are differences. And this is the interesting issue with the approach that I've been taking. Linguists often get furious with me because I don't acknowledge context. And the reality is all of this stuff depends hugely on context. So in formal settings, the more formal the setting, the less we use personal pronouns. The more we use articles, the less we use auxiliary verbs and so forth. And as things get more and more informal, they change. Looking at writing versus speaking, the real art form from the experimentalist's perspective is maintaining context. And so very often if it's speaking, it's almost more informal than when it's written. And of course it depends on how the study's done. But the studies that we've looked at, they hold up pretty much the same. They do, for example, with the deception projects. They do with depression. They do with style matching. Mm-hmm.
How does the use of passive or active voice affect this? Whether with passive voice, you're more likely to use prepositions?
Actually, it's just the opposite.
Okay.
I didn't tell you this, and I guess I better because it's so interesting. The psychometrics of words, of function words, is remarkable. So here we've got impersonal pronouns, personal pronouns, articles, conjunctions, auxiliary verbs, negations, conjunctions, selected adverbs. These are words like so, really, and so forth. So there's 8 of them. We've analyzed these across huge corpora, everything from blogs to admissions essays. And if you do an intercorrelation, what you find is that articles and prepositions are highly correlated with each other positively, and those two are negatively correlated with all the others. So auxiliary verbs, pronouns, etc., both personal and impersonal, etc., are all positively correlated with each other and negatively correlated with articles and prepositions. Now, if we reverse code those, we can just add them all together, and psychometrically, you have an instrument of 8 items, and the the Kronbach or Spearman-Brown or whatever is about 0.75. It's like a real scale. Now, what does this real scale measure? Well, we call it the categorical dynamic index, so that if you're high on it, you are using nouns and prepositions at high rates, and you're using pronouns and auxiliary verbs at low rates. And at the other end, it's just the opposite. You are using pronouns and auxiliary verbs at high rates, passive verbs if you like. So here's what's interesting. You now have this index, and we can now go in and start to analyze. First of all, you get huge sex differences. Males are higher on the categorical than the dynamic. You can look at different corpora. The more formal the speech, the higher the CDI. The more narrative the speech, the higher, the lower they are on this cognitive dynamic index. Is it related to personality? Now we have giant samples. We can look at depression. We can look at, the big five, so extroversion and so forth. It's not related to any personality measures. There's a really, really weak correlation with social skills, but the correlation is 0.1, which is significant because we have big samples, but that's it. But here's the clincher. We created this because we were analyzing admissions essays. We have 50,000 admissions essays for 25,000 students who've been admitted to the University of Texas over 4 years. And we have tracked their grades over all 4 years. This CDI does a shockingly good job at predicting grade point average across all 4 years of college. And it doesn't matter if the person's in nursing, engineering, fine arts, psychology, it makes no difference. The more categorical they're writing in their admissions essays, the better their grades. And the simple correlation is about a 0.2, 0.22. It varies a little bit depending on the college. That's remarkable. Now, it is related to SAT. It is related to social class in the same directions. But even if you put those in first, it still accounts for a little bit of variance on top of it, only 1 or 2%, but still, I'll take it. So here we have this psychologically interesting dimension that's not related to any questionnaires, which has made, boy, has this been a tough one for us to try to sell. We submitted it to a top psychology journal, and you could tell that the people thought we were nuts because it wasn't related to anything psychological. Yes, it's related to, all of these things that are culturally important, but not questionnaires. And I think what it's doing is capturing how people think, which is a very long way to answer your question. When people are using passive or auxiliary verbs, they also are using pronouns. They're being much more human in the way that they're talking. Whereas people who are more categorical in their thinking, they are approaching the world differently. It also, I think this project is interesting because it also tells us how our educational system is structured. Think about how all our tests are. I don't care what your field is, and it could be fine arts, or it could be psychology or anthropology or biology, makes no difference. Our tests are, we ask people to categorize things. We never ask people to tell us a story. Narratives are never part of education, even in an English department, where it's presumably telling stories. The real tests are not stories. They still are, what are the 3 reasons Shakespeare, blah, 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 blah. And this is what, and it makes me wonder the degree which our educational system is essentially aimed in this direction, and or maybe this is just Western culture in general that's pushing this. Yes?
You mentioned that in those email messages, the use of the word I, you thought was a bit like the submissive posture of a lower status dominant.
Mm-hmm.
And you also pointed out the anatomical correlations in strokes and the use of function words or not. And it seems to me that suggests strokes in affecting either Broca's.
Yeah.
So it suggests that somebody might have investigated the neuroanatomy of the use of function words, for example, the size of certain structures, and also that others might have investigated similarities with behaviors in animals, like is it really true that their social behavior in a dog is controlled by frontal functions and so forth?
Well, there have been a number of interesting things. So, for example, personality. The first person to discover this with dogs was Pavlov. He talked about, he was trying to find out the seat of learning. So he would do these lesion studies where he destroyed different parts of the brain. And in his writing, he said that, so you could destroy the vision part and the dog couldn't see, but it was the same dog. And he could do all this stuff, but if you damaged the frontal lobe, he said it was a different dog. It changed the dog's personality. And we've known this ever since the invention of the motorcycle and motorcycle accidents and other kinds of ways that influence the brain. There are two issues about linking language with the neuroanatomy. The effects I'm telling you about hold up beautifully with brain damage studies. There have been a lot of studies looking at EEG, looking at fMRI and other issues, trying to link Broca's and Wernicke's area to ongoing speech. And it turns out to be a lot messier. It works great for brain destruction, but not for picking up what's happening at the time. There was one other issue about this that was relevant. Well, I can't remember, but it was a really good point. Yes?
So you said that a lot of patterns you found hold up cross-culturally and things like that, but I'm wondering if there's any way to see larger social movements in the way that we think. So I'm thinking of the Enlightenment, right? Definitely brought in categorical thinking as the way of thinking.
Ooh, that's a very interesting, that's a very interesting idea. And of course, the Google Books project, I think, is very likely one of the most important projects, in my lifetime. And if you haven't read the science paper that Michel and his group put out, this is not Walter Michel, this is another Michel at Harvard. It came out in December of 2010. I think it's a profound statement in terms of how we're able to go and look at how we can look at words and others through every book that's ever been published, or it's going in that direction. I don't know what the percentage of books that have now been done by Google, but it's stunning, and you could certainly look at that. By the way, everything I've been saying, I forgot to mention, I guess I should have mentioned, that everything I'm talking about can be looked at on a much broader level, not just individuals. We've done work we look at blogs and how people write in blogs before, during, and after 9/11. You get a sense of cultures. We've been involved in these projects looking at Twitter feeds and looking at how the tweets change in the nature of their language as a function of the Libyan upheaval, the Egyptian upheavals, and so forth. We and others have looked at all these other types of data, and where we are getting a sense of very large groups of people. And that's one reason I think this stuff is so exciting, because you can get a sense of cultures. Another thing that we've been looking at is looking at communities. So, for example, we downloaded all of the Craigslist for, I think it was a month, in 30 large cities in the United States. And these were all, the cities were, we had certain rules. They had to be, I think, between 1 and 2 million people. And then what we would do is just look at, say, places for rent, cars for sale, and furniture. I think those were our three. And then we'd look and see how similar the language is. So we're getting this style matching within community. And so our idea is, what can we learn about a community by looking at the way it uses language? Well, what we found was the degree to which the language within a community is similar. That is, the higher the style matching, the lower the Gini index. And the Gini index, I think I'm right, the higher the number, the greater disparity in wealth. And as it gets smaller, there's less disparity. And what we found was that there was a nice correlation between the Gini index and disparity in language. And it kind of makes sense. If your town has very rich and very poor, the people probably aren't talking to one another as much as if everybody is kind of on the same page. Yes.
Have you looked at style matching in relation to like Creole languages?
No, I haven't. No, I haven't.
I don't know if that would maybe be an indicator of how strongly they're, I don't know. But also I was wondering about personality disorders, like if you've seen anything in relation to.
There've been a number of studies looking at personality disorders. I have not been involved in that work. Jeff Hancock has published some nice work on psychopaths. There have been a couple of studies on narcissism. We found a little bit on it, but not as much as you might think. It's not related to I, by the way. If anything, it goes in the way opposite direction of what you would expect. And that brings up the point my third point on, and that is the link of, and this may even be your question about the Creole reminded me. Broca's area is very interesting. Now, an area that is controversial, and I'm hesitant to say it if there was an fMRI person in the room, but the Broca's area is also the area that's been posited to be related to motor neurons. And the idea of a motor neuron is one where if I'm watching a football game that and the guy has to kick the ball, how my leg will almost involuntarily kick as the kicker is trying to help him along. That those neurons that are being activated are the same. And I find it very...
You're meaning mirror neurons rather than just motor neurons.
Yeah, did I say motor neurons? I meant mirror neurons. And the big debate about mirror neurons is that really the process that people are claiming? And at a certain level, I don't really care. Because what's interesting to me is that no matter what, it's getting at the same issue of mimicry. That this mimicry we see in behaviors, we're also seeing in language. That when people are, in fact, connecting, it's through these function words. Mm-hmm.
Have you studied children and how things change with age, and how you can really predict in an early age if the individual is likely to have troubles of any kind?
You know, that's a very interesting question. I don't know of any work on that in terms of kind of using this as a long-term predictor. And my guess is it wouldn't be, we do as well as just about anybody else, which is better than chance but not very good. We have been doing some work with young kids, so kids 4 years old and 5 years old. One of the strategies that we developed several years ago, and Matthias Mell, one of my former students, has really taken this to a new level, is we have a device called the ear. It's the electronically activated recorder. It's a tape recorder that comes on for 30 seconds or sometimes longer and then goes off for 12 minutes. And people wear this sometimes for days at a time. We did this with families, about 40 families. And the parents would wear the ear, and then the kids, we gave them a T-shirt, and the parents, one morning, on a Saturday or Sunday morning, was told to put in this tape recorder, turned it on, and put it inside their shirt. And then the kid wore the shirt all day, and then we'd usually get about 12 hours before the battery died. And then what we did, we had them do this 2 years in a row, and first of all, to see the degree to which they use language separately, even though their language is developing like crazy. And you do find very real similarities. But one of the things we started to discover was their language was very much influenced by their parents, and you could get a measure of their style matching with their parents. And as you might expect, the kids who had more behavior problems over the next years, reported by teachers and parents and so forth, was related to lower style matching with the kids and their parents. The effects are, I will say the effects on that are pretty modest, but it's certainly worth looking at, I think, with bigger samples down the road. Mm-hmm.
It strikes me there's a number of interesting issues in relation to mental state attribution, developmental issues, and then into the evolution of language,
mm-hmm.
The evolution of human cognitive capacities,
mm-hmm.
Evolution of the sense of identity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a rich set of areas that also go further back in time than
mm-hmm.
word methodologies.
That's right. That's right.
So far.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I would, and this is the kind of stuff that would be so delightful to work on, and especially with language samples themselves. Yes?
So is low style matching in children indicative of late, do they grow out of it, do you think, or is it something that carries on throughout their lifetime?
You know, I don't know. This style matching is I should tell you, style matching is, from a psychological perspective, a vexing problem to deal with, because we usually think of something like style matching as an individual difference, but the reality is it's like dancing. So you have, how do you measure dancing in a single person? Where you have somebody who can be a lousy dancer with 9/10 of the other people, and then they dance really well with somebody else, with one particular person. So it's an interactional measure that we are, in a sleazy kind of way, applying to the individual. So with this, it's very likely we can say, well, the problem isn't the kid, the problem is with the parents.
The environment.
Or the environment as well. This study, by the way, was one of the most interesting studies, because here the parents are at home on this Saturday, and it took if we have 10 hours of data, it took 40 hours to transcribe that one kid's day. And what was interesting about it was this wild variation in terms of how these parents would spend with their kids. We have some where the father would be with the kid for 3 hours, and the two of them would just sit there and play games the whole time, and they would never talk. Style matching, you know, they didn't use words much, but I mean, there was really interesting variation there. Yes?
You had talked about the differences in the genders in terms of their use of pronouns. Is there any overlap, and is there also any indication that people of transgendered people rank anywhere in between that, or to one end of the spectrum or the other?
I can answer that kind of. About 15 years ago, I was contacted by a friend of mine, Jim Dabbs, who did a lot of work on testosterone. He'd gotten an email from a person, a biological female, who was going through a gender identity project, and she was now taking large doses of testosterone. And it so happened that let's refer to this person as a he, had kept diaries prior to the testosterone and afterwards, and also he kept records of when the testosterone injections occurred, usually once every 3 weeks. I was sitting in a bar in Cambridge talking to an anthropologist. How many stories have you heard start off this way? And this was a biological male who was taking testosterone injections because he was losing upper body strength. And I was telling him this story, and he said, yeah, I've been taking testosterone injections. I said, oh, that's interesting. Do you keep records of when you take them? Yes. Do you save your old emails? I asked him, and he said yes. And so he sent me all of his emails over 2 years, and I compared the data that he had with the transgendered person. And before I analyzed the data, I sent them an email asking them, how does testosterone affect you psychologically? What dimensions of language do you think it'll change? And it was stunning in terms of what they said. The anthropologist says it has absolutely no biological effects on me, or psychological effects. The transgendered person says it has huge effects on me. I know I talk more about sports. I know I have higher self-esteem. I know I do this. I know I just do this. So I analyzed the data, and they're both, interestingly, completely wrong. And and the differences were really interesting. The primary difference was the use of pronouns, but not I. It was all other pronouns, all social pronouns. We, you, he, she, they. For both of them, when they took the testosterone injections, they stopped making references to other people. And then as the testosterone wears off, you can almost see them, looking around saying, wow, look at all these other people. And they start making references to others, and then they get that testosterone injection, and they're cured. And, and now they don't pay any attention to other people. And this goes on over and over again. It had no effect on emotion language. It had no effect on anything else we were looking at. Now keep in mind that testosterone injections are really weird because what they do is they really pump your testosterone levels up to incredibly high rates, and then you get this gradual drop. And so, for example, the transgendered person, I don't know what that person's language was like before she even thought about going through this. It's very possible there were changes. But it's a really interesting question. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if perhaps what makes fictional language, like in novels or in movies, seem, or like one component of what makes it seem more natural would be its conforming to these regularities. And so if you look to see if like the sex differences or the status differences apply also in fictional language.
We have, and we've looked at this in a lot of different ways. I've been particularly interested in looking at ancient languages. So looking at, some of Antigone's work, or, it's been ages. I'm blocking on the stories. One of the famous ancient Greek stories is the one where a god comes to Earth, but he's made to look like he's a poor person, and there's the big honcho in the community who treats the god like dirt. And then at some point, the god reveals himself and destroys this guy. And so you can see their language. Well, when the god comes as a poor person, he uses I at really high rates, and the other guy, of course, this is all in translation. I've also looked at the writings of Saint Basil. These, how I've come across these things is so weird. Saint Basil was a guy who lived in what is now Turkey, but they spoke kind of an ancient form of Greek. And he wrote these letters, this voluminous letters, and they've all been saved, and the translations are really nice translations. And the way he writes to high status people, he uses I all the time. When he writes to people who are beneath him, and he makes it clear they're beneath him, he doesn't use self-referencing at all. So you do see this. I can't remember what your question was, but it's a great story.
Fiction versus
Oh yeah, fiction. Oh, that's right. So we've used it for that. We've also done a lot of work recently. One of my students, Molly Ireland, has been doing work on how well does an author capture the language of males versus females. I was asked this in a colloquium several years ago. And my wife's a writer, and I said, oh yeah, well they do a great job at it. And then I went home that night in a motel room, and my computer, I have, always travel with hundreds of thousands of texts. And I happened to have the language, I had Romeo and Juliet and Sleepless in Seattle. And Sleepless in Seattle was written by Nora Ephron, and then of course Shakespeare. Well, it turns out that both Romeo and Juliet talk a lot like men, and the main character, male and female characters in Nora Ephron's movie, talk a lot like women. And it turns out that both men and women writers do better than chance at making their characters talk like males and females, but there's a distinct bias. So, and there are huge individual differences, so some won't surprise you. Two that come to mind is one who's particularly good at capturing the voice of women and of men is Thornton Wilder for Our Town. And someone who's particularly bad is Quentin Tarantino. For example, the character that I love, that I find the most interesting, I was trying to figure out, okay, feminine character in Tarantino. What about in Pulp Fiction? I forget the actress's name, but she was the woman from France who was dating Bruce Willis. And and you analyze her language, even though she comes across as quite feminine, her language is ultra masculine. but when you watch the movie or you even read it, you don't pick it up until you actually do the analysis.
What about What about I mean, we're going into all these applications. What about presidential debates?
Well, of course, I've done tons of presidential debates.
This is your softball.
It is. It is. They're so interesting. So, first of all, it's interesting to compare Obama versus Bush versus Clinton and Reagan. I love this. Does Obama use I words above average or below average in terms of other presidents?
Well, he's considered among some inner circles detached, though likable, so I would think he would be less.
Yes, he uses I words lower than any modern American president. And the conservative press is convinced he uses I more than anybody they've ever heard. There have been editorials about this. It's really interesting.
That's just Rush Limbaugh.
No, it's Peggy Noonan, George Will, Limbaugh, of course. But it's really striking how, because when he uses I, you know, it knocks you back because it sounds almost out of context when he uses it. George Bush used I at very high rates. And in fact, one thing that got me into all of this was I was reading a New York Times piece when Bush was running against Kerry. So here you have Kerry, stiff, rigid, and then here's Bush, much looser. And I read in the newspaper that Kerry's advisors are fortunately aware that he's rigid and stiff, and so what they're trying to do is change his vocabulary so he starts using the word we more. Well, he had some smart advisors, but they didn't know jack about language. He was already using we at twice the rate of Bush. And what he should have been doing is trying to get him to use I more, or better yet, not be so rigid and uptight. But that just goes to show how poor we are at hearing this. The one that interested me the most is Reagan. So we can compare Reagan with Clinton and Bush. Clinton and Bush actually talk somewhat similarly.
Bush 1 or Bush 2?
Bush 2.
2.
Yeah. No, please. Let's stop at 2. Let's stop at 2.
I know.
But Bush 2 and Clinton talk alike in the sense they're both very social. They both use I at high rates. They both really work to connect with an audience. Now, Reagan is interesting because he was always viewed as this very social guy. But you analyze his language, he doesn't use I very much at all. He's actually surprisingly detached. But what he does is he uses the language of stories in social narratives. So he's a storyteller. And somehow we've used storytelling as the same thing as being warm. And he's not warm, he's a storyteller. So these are the kind of things.
Lincoln too, actually.
Is that right? I haven't,
I think so.
you know, because what I have restricted my analyses to are press conferences. And the modern press conference, the first press conferences were with Hoover, but they had to submit the questions by paper beforehand. And then FDR had them, but you read these press conferences and most of them are off the record. So we'd say, okay, boys, because the press corps was all male, let's just turn off the recorders now. And that would be the press conference. So it wasn't until Truman that we start getting them, yeah.
One puzzle that this study poses, since there's so much information in language, we would have expected, and language is so important for the listener, I think we would have expected natural selection would provide individuals with ways to do what you are doing now, naturally. And it doesn't seem so, right? We are not as good at detecting lies, for instance, which is something very important.
Right.
So it's a bit
Well,
of a mystery, no?
that's an interesting question. I often think of function words as being very similar to nonverbal behaviors. And so when a person is stiff and formal, we pick it up in the way that they're standing and their voice tenor. And it's also there in the words that they're using. So they all go together. So, I mean, we're given, from an evolutionary perspective, the human is giving off all of these signals that they should pick up. And I think they usually do. And with deception, you know, here's another interesting thing that happens with deception. Jeff Hancock has done this work. if you have two people talking and then you tell one of them, at this point in the conversation, I want you to start lying, what happens to style matching? Well, it turns out it goes up. And I think, and we found the same kind of thing, and I think one reason is if I'm having a conversation and all of a sudden you start lying, something doesn't sound right. And I start listening more closely and I start mirroring what you're saying. I had my students, and I did it myself, to tape record some conversations with friends, and their friends knew that they were being tape recorded. And I told them that they had to have 2 or 3 conversations, and each conversation would be 5 minutes. Then I actually called 2 of my students who had done work on style matching. So I call and say, hey, Kate, this is Jamie. I just wanted to talk. It's going to be a little experiment. I just want to talk about stuff. And it was okay if we record. Fine. And then I would open an envelope, and the envelope would tell me whether or not I would be doing arithmetic problems as fast as I can while the conversation's going on. So the first one I had, it was just a regular conversation. And then I'd hang up and call them back a few minutes later and say, okay, we can continue. And then I start doing these arithmetic problems like crazy. And at the end I thought, man, I'm good at this. You know, I'm able to keep the conversation going. It's just, and sure enough, my style matching was slightly higher on the second one than the first. And what happened afterwards, I talked to my students about this, you know, what was going on. And I was clearly detaching some, but then they were kind of detaching some as well. They were doing what I was doing. And I also, because I transcribed everything I said, you know, there were certain things I started to do. Oh, there were certain things I would start doing. I'd repeat. I was less of a conversationalist. The other thing that one of my students said, she said, "Oh, it was just you. You often talk that way." Yeah, which.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.